unlikely. So this this idea was from some little presentation I did, and there's really three parts. There's obviously what the polar region is, and as it's about orchids, it's about the origin of them. The second part is those orchids up in the north of the available space that they can grow. And then the final bit is about stamps and cancels that are being used in polar locations. So this is a little introduction. Most people don't realize quite how exact a thing is that those areas north of 66 degrees 34 minutes north are the polar bits and the equal bit in the south. Now the thing is that if you have a map like this, you can see the squiggly green line on the right hand side in Russia. That's the tree line. So trees grow into the Arctic Circle. They might not be very big, maybe a couple of feet, but they do grow there. And then you can also see a yellow sort of zone, and that's the 10-degree isotherm. So if you think about 10 degrees, if the land can be at 10 degrees, there's almost certainly going to be some plants growing there. And so that's why in this part of the world around the North Pole, there are actually lots of areas where lots and lots of plants can grow. Similarly, if you take Antarctica, the chilliness shown by the colors on the map makes it clear that it's much too cold for any vascular plants to live. And so in actual fact, the only things that grow there are algae and other very simple plants. So hopefully you can read this little bit at the top, and that is that unexpectedly, the whole of the Antarctic is kind of the breeding ground for the original orchids. And they came through Antarctica about 145 to about 66 million years ago. And Antarctica was part of Gondwana land. So that's roughly what it looked like at that time. So you can see South America and Africa closely associated with each other. And next door, you can see Australia and Antarctica as well. So they're all there or thereabouts. This postmark or this stamp came from the envelope that you can see in the bottom right hand corner, and that's a 1981 World Orchid Conference stamp on a research vessel out in the Atlantic at a place called Marion Island. Unfortunately, it's not inside the Arctic Circle, so it doesn't count for my kind of display of this, but it's a good place for a Gondwana land postmark. The British Antarctic Territory issue back in 1982 clearly shows the evolution of this part of the world. And although it's not very clear the way these are portrayed, as you go up in terms of value, you get closer to the present, with the present one being the 26p stamp. And it also appears, just by chance, that orchids appeared in Australia about 112 million years ago, and then via Antarctica to the rest of the neotropics. So they're the ones who, that's how they moved across. Now, it's true to say that the ancestors of them probably didn't look anything like the ones we've got today, but the four big families. There is one other one, the vanilloids, the cypridioids, the orchidoids, and the epidendroids. They all started to appear in the neotropics. So that's in the parts of Asia and of Africa that were in the tropics. And that's where the diversity that we see today came about. So if we go back to that massive, great big cover, you can clearly see now the pictures. So the blue one, the 3P, is about 280 million years ago. So Gondwana land, as it was one massive, great big continent, and the center of it would have been very desert conditions and so on. And then as you go along, you get to 230 million years, and notice there's a kind of a dinosaur-y looking creature. If you're interested in this sort of stuff, this creature, the skeletal remains of it occur in Brazil and in parts of Africa. And it's what convinced Alfred Wagner that there really was something called continental drift. And so that creature was one of the things that he used to prove that it was going on. And then if I just give you the next couple of important dates, and you can clearly see that if you go to the 50 million years ago and further back, these guys, this Pachycephalosaurus and the Tyrannosaurus, they would have been able to roam all the way into Antarctica. And just last week, it was published in one of the nature journals that they'd found the first bird footprint from this era in Antarctica. So there's an awful lot of kind of historical and paleontological information coming out of Antarctica. Okay, so first of all, the distribution of these plants now, these are the vanilla ones, and today they only exist in those tropical places. You can see them in Kew Gardens, but it'll be in the tropical house. And there's lots of varieties, and you can probably see them off the screen. There's no point reading them, but many of them have been moved around by humans because we're very interested in vanilla planifolia because that's the one that you have in the kitchen. So it's worth knowing that they are a kind of an important aspect of this. Right. Where does the name orchid come from? It was decided by Linnaeus back when he was doing his description. 1753 is the date that's always mentioned. And he got it from the Greek word for testicle. And that doesn't seem to make much sense until you look at some orchis stamps, and then you realize that it definitely makes it clear why they thought that that was the case. So that's how they got their name. The next group, epiand and dendron, and that's a Greek name for up on trees or upon trees, and it really refers to all the epiphytic orchids that you see in the tropical regions. And once again, Linnaeus, he's the one who gave it its name, but you can see that it's 10 years after the orchis ones. These are some examples: a Russian cover and a Granada stamp, but there are hundreds and hundreds of these, so it could be a stamp show all on its own. The fourth group, which we would call them lady slipper orchids, is Cypridium, and it comes from the cypris for Aphrodite and pedilon for sandal. So the sandal or so on for the name of these orchids. Now, we don't normally associate these things with the polar regions, but they are very widespread in that region. This is the British one, and It's you've probably seen the stamp, may even have this postcard sitting in a collection somewhere. But everybody's got them. The Swiss have them, and this is a Pro Juventud issue. And typically the tabs on these stamps always have the names in various languages. So in French, Sabot de Venus, Farfallone, we think is the name in not Italian, but actually in Romansh, and then their proper Latin name, and then Frauenschuhen in German. So typical kind of issue. And then lastly, for my little bit on the families, this orchid, this lady slipper orchid, is so sought after by plant collectors that it's now a red book species in CITES, because so many people have just stolen them from the wild. And then on. So these are the countries that are actually inside the Arctic Circle. No surprises there. The only one I have not put anything for is Finland. So all the rest of them, you will get to see at least some of their own stamps and some of their own orchids. The largest area by far is Russia, and there are at least 35 orchids, but there are probably more. It's just that they're not as well researched as some other parts of the world, and the Russian lists are a bit more difficult to access, particularly now, as you can well imagine. So they have at least 3 of these Cypridium species in their polar region. This one is Macranthum, and you can see it's on this prepaid cover. It's quite a recent one. It's only about it's 2012. And then these orchids extend all the way to Korea. So they're very widespread in their distribution. The next one, obviously, is the same one as we have, Cypridium calceolus. And then lastly, there's this one, Cypridium guttatum. And I've only been able to find a few examples. And as you can see, one's from Mongolia and one's from Madagascar. So for some reason, these haven't appeared on Russian issues. Okay, there are 3 types of Epipactis, a kind of terrestrial orchid that grows there. This is a Russian, as you can see, 1991 stamp, and a prepaid envelope, typically of the Russian sort of postal service issue. Polar Russia, 7 different Dactylorsia species, and only 2 of them on stamps for this purpose. There's Dactylorsia maculata, and you can see the variation in the color, even in these 2. You get them all over Britain. It's a very common orchid. And then the next one is Fuchsii, or Fuchsii, and on the Isle of Man, and the white one is growing on limestone in Ireland. And so this lady's tresses orchid in Ireland is like that, rather than calling it the common spotted orchid. There's another one that's very common in Russian polar regions. It's Plantheria bifolia. And just so that you know, that the one on the right is a card issued by the Estonian post office, which has all the versions of the stamp and their postmarks all in one go. And so this is a prepaid postcard. So you could technically put it in a stamp display. The one on the left is a 1969 Soviet cover, and it's prepaid, and the orchid is just in this kind of painted form on the side. So this is Plantanthera bifolia. And here is a kind of like a resume of some of the others, because you can't necessarily do them all. So Calypso bulbosa, there's this one, Gymnadia conopsia, and then Goodyear repens, but you have to look really, really carefully because it's actually behind the butterfly. And why why the Hungarians put it on a stamp, I don't know, but it's on their list as well. And then lastly, Hammerbaya paludosa, and you can see this is even from even a more obscure area. This is a stamp from a Congo sheet. There's lots more on the Russian checklist, of course, but they all repeat in North America and Arctic Europe simply because the connection is made so that they can just travel all the way across, just like reindeer and elk and all the rest of it can go from Europe to North America. So Sweden then is next. So I don't know that you'd be surprised that in 1955 there was an issue with Cypridium and Calypso on. This is what it looked like, which is a bit of a strange thing. This guy is Daniel Amadeus Atterbom, not somebody who the British know very much about. He was a very interesting romantic poet, and his seminal work is something called Blomorna, the flowers, and that's why the flowers are in his memorial issue. For those of you who like Swedish stamps, this is the kind of like the usual setup. You've on the left-hand side, there's a coil stamp. In the middle, there's two from a booklet. The one in the center is a used one, but it's just showing that you have a one edge one as well. And then the 140 stamp is from a coil. The two booklets, just slightly different colors. It's because this was such a popular issue, I suppose. They actually had two print runs and the books came out like that. The next thing that I picked out is these wild orchids, as you can see in Swedish at the top. And it came out as a kind of a nice sheet. This one is number 1. I've got them up to 38, but I presume there must be even more. So there's a kind of an enormous number of them. The orchids on here, as you can see, come from the same families as we've already had, but these are just slightly different ones, apart from Palostris is back again and Calceolus as well. And then they carry on issuing them. This is Nigritella, and this one's, as you can see, is one from a booklet, and this one too is from a booklet, and this is Cephalanthera rubra. But you can see the landscape that these come from, and it's this northern part of Sweden where it's sand dunes and so on the coast of the Baltic or on the White Sea. Here we go. What's next? This is the 1968 issue. The orchid is Platanthera bifolia, and this is what it looks like when you've got the complete sort of arrangement of it. You can clearly see that the orchid is this one, that row, and it's part of the flora of the whole of this northern region of Sweden, and the rest of the plants that are there, I don't want to go over into something else, but they're all ones that go with it. This was designed by Annie Bergman, who apparently is a really important artist. But more importantly, I suppose for us, it was engraved by Czesław Slania. And luckily, while I was looking for these, I picked up one which had been signed by him. So that's quite a nice, like, extra orchidy, stampy thing. Oh, what's happened there? My thing has gone wrong on this one. Oh, there we go. So these are the rest of the Swedish ones, and obviously you can read the names for yourself, but this is typically how they issue their stamps. They come in booklets, all the same value, and this one is the letter rate, and so it's got breathe on it rather than anything else, and all of the information, not that my Swedish is really particularly good, is on the back. But this is typical of them, and you can see the same species of orchids coming around again. Another one, this one's from the Northern National Parks, and you can see that this one has this Calypso bulbosa on it, and you can see the nice sort of strips that they did. There was also another issue with the same ones in, but in little blocks of 4. I didn't put it in. Norwegian one, so this would be up on the very north where Norway butts the Russian parts of the polar region. And interestingly, when Norway issues their stamps in their booklets like this, they also put one of the orchids or one of the plants on the outside. So this is the form that they would take. Quite shallow roots, very simple leaves, and then the flower on top. This is another set from a slightly different period, but once again, the plant is on the outside cover of the booklet. These are, it seems to me, the same ones coming around, except for this Ophrys insectifera. And you'd have to realize, I suppose, that as you look at the picture on the screen, that is at least double the size of the flower in the wild. So this is a very small little flower, just about big enough for a bee to be confused and land on it and think that it's a female. So that's the method of reproduction for them. Greenland obviously is inside this zone, this polar zone. The 425 stamp that you can see is Triphidia. The 450, which is the kind of dark blue background, and also the back of it is Rotundifolia, and you can quite easily see why it got that name. And the 750 is Hyperborean. So this is one that's from that particular region. These stamps were issued when Queen Margaretha went to visit. Obviously, it wasn't part of Denmark anymore, but she was still visiting. And consequently, you get a kind of a view of what the landscape is like. These orchids are growing in this landscape that you can see on the panes, lurking in the background. So amongst the scree on the lower one, and on the cliffs, and against the, where the sea water sprays on the other one. So that's the ones, and this is what the booklet looked like when it was complete. There she is on the cover, and you can see that this was quite an expensive little booklet to buy. The next one is into Canada now. Sparrow's egg lady's slipper is a bit of a weird idea, but if you've ever seen a sparrow's egg, you'll have a kind of an idea of the size that we're perhaps talking about. So it's a very small shoe that the orchid has. These grow entirely over the whole of the north of Canada and into Alaska, and probably beyond that into the Aleutian Islands. But this one is kind of, it seems synonymous for me anyway, with all things Canadian. So it's been featured on the cover of definitive booklets, and as you can see, the dates back in the late 70s. If you're interested to find them in Stanley Gibbons, that's their numbers there, all printed by the British American Banknote Company. Not seen it myself, but this is what they look like. And as the years went by, they changed the color on the outside. So you ended up with this kind of very neat set. The same orchid has been part of the National Definitive series, and you can see it ran for quite a while. But there were lots of different runs. And so each of them has a different perf, slightly different, and most of them are litho, but the last issue is in photogravure. So this is what they look like. And the little tiny bit of text at the bottom is what I've used to illustrate these. And then there were so many of these printed that there are lots of examples of the plates kind of moving around, and you're getting all sorts of strange effects on these stamps, but that's not really part of this, so I didn't put it in. Okay. The Orchids of Canada issue is from one of these conferences that the Canadians were part of. And this is the mini sheet that they issued. And you can see the Amarorchis rotundifolia, the one that we had just earlier on, is back again. This time the Cypridium is pubescens, Aerithus bulbosa, we've seen that one previously, and then a new one, Planthera cycodes. One of the things about the habitat that these plants are growing in is that the nutrients available to them is incredibly thin on the ground, and consequently no two plants will look the same. And I was trying to find some way to express this idea that the plants themselves vary greatly from one place to another, not only just different colors, but all sorts of different morphologies. So I use this to try and illustrate that. So let me just, will it move on? I hope it will. Okay, so in this same issue, they had loads of variations. As you can see, this is from a Canadian collector's list. These are the variations that exist for this particular one. This is Aerithus, and you can clearly see that there are just these little variations in it. And in the wild, that's exactly what would happen. Here's the Amarorchis, and once again, different variations, slightly different things, which is kind of representative of what would happen in the wild. These ones are Planthera, and you get, this one had 4 variations. I have no idea why these things happened. It seems a very strange thing, but it was presumably just movement in the printing of these. Most of these are used because finding them on the sheets is a nightmare, because the sheets that were available to purchase by collectors all came from one printing, and these have obviously come from other print runs that created all of the different versions. Canada goes on printing plenty of definitive stamps, and this is the 2006 one. These are Arctic stamps from Canada, and you can see But these two, we've got another one. This is parviflorum. They all look relatively similar, but they are all different individual species. And obviously Calypso, we've had that one before. This series also had some other stamps to make up the rest of it. And the one in the first position, this one, is one of these coral Lohisa orchids. This thing is probably, once it's fully grown, it's probably only 4 or 5 centimeters high and is very well equipped to cope with the incredibly cold temperatures of the north. This is the 4th flower series, so the Canadians have lots of flower series, but this one are all polar ones. First one is another one of these Corallosia ones. This one is striata, and the background of the 4 stamps is this orchid in sort of slightly more detail. The next one is another Epipactis. This one is gigantine. I don't know that it's that big, but it's named for that. The next one is Calopogon tuberosus. Never ever seen one, but that's what it is. And then lastly, Pogonia ophioglossoides. So quite an interesting collection. So these are flowers from this series. They are all polar ones, and it's amazing that they actually use them on their stamp issues, probably because it's kind of part of reinforcing the diversity of their own flora. So the last of the USA one, or that's the last of the Canadian ones, but the USA ones, rather than using their stamps to start with, I thought I'd try and do it with the labels and stamps that come from the National Wildlife Federation. Every year they send out a book and a great big sheet of sticky stamps that you can put in your book to make an album of the flora and fauna of the USA. So these are the orchids that come from the polar regions. And as you can see, it's the old favorite. Not so much this one. This is Acule. The Americans call it the moccasin flower, which is probably not surprising. This is Silaris, the yellow fringed orchid, as it says. And you can see that this is quite a bigger one, and this would only occur where there was running fresh water and so on. But in the most northern parts, this would only be about the size of your finger. And then Cypridium parviflorum is probably not really a separate orchid. It's probably a subspecies of the usual ladies' slipper orchid. 1984 World Orchid Congress. Once again, they were orchids in the American issue, and these ones you may have seen before. They're all American orchids. Only this one down here, Solites divarticata, is not an Alaskan orchid. The other 3 you can find in Alaska, which is quite incredible. And one of the things that I quite like about these older American issues is that you can get them pre-cancelled. This one's from Hawaii, which seems a strange place for an orchid from the Arctic to end up. But what happens, or what was happening, is that you could get your stamps pre-cancelled, pay a few cents to the postmaster who would give them a bash with a local cancellation. But it's outlawed by the American post office now, and so this has been cut off really, and you can't get any new ones. So the latest orchids are never going to appear with these interesting locations. This is one of maybe 5,000 or 6,000 that exist just for this issue. So now, unfortunately, we've got through to where the postmarks are. So this one is from Abisko, as you can see, and it's a research station up in the Arctic Circle. I had to fiddle around with the picture to make it visible because it was very faint on the original envelope. But you can see the orchids that we had looked at earlier. The Calypso is there with some other things, but you can also see some of the birds that don't belong in this habitat. So a hawfinch and a greater spotted woodpecker, they shouldn't be there. But there we go. So that's that one. Hopefully it will move on. Okay, this is a Canadian postmark for inside the Arctic Circle, this place called Copper Mine. Once again, never been there. Don't know if anybody's been to Copper Mine. And you can see our orchid, the sparrow's egg one has reappeared. Nice cover to Cluj-Napoca in Romania. This is a southern one, and as you can see, this is a helicopter expedition to Antarctica. I don't know what on earth they were doing. I never have been able to work it out, but somebody put a stylized orchid embroidery stamp on this inside the Arctic Circle. Inside the Antarctic Circle. And so it fitted my kind of criteria for what would be. So it's a 1974 issue. This is a bit of a weird thing. This is the Belgian Antarctic base, so everything's correct. It's got its proper postmark for the South Pole, the Zuidpool, and you can see that it then ended up in Brussels. But why it had a German stamp on it, I have no idea. Never been able to find anything more apart from what it's got on the postmarks. For those of you who collect Falkland Islands, the 2P one is a dog orchid, and this one had a little trip to Antarctica on one of these original tourist expeditions. This is Lindblad. They were the first company that did tours from the Falkland Islands down to Antarctica, and this is kind of typical of the covers that were produced for people who were on board. And then it was posted in Port Stanley and made its way, in this case, to somewhere in West Germany. Okay, seems strange to think about it, but Argentina has a claim on Antarctica. They have their own little tiny slice, and this orchid, which is the right hand top one of the three plants, is Oncidium bifolium, and this is a 1985 issue. So this is the third incarnation of this particular stamp. But you can clearly see that this has been sent from their Antarctic base called Jubani, but can't find out very much about it. It's not the sort of thing that's easy to get information about. They were very interested in Antarctica, and so they publicized their business in Antarctica with exhibitions in in Buenos Aires and so on. And on these ones, I've got the 1959 exhibition stamps, which I found with their visit the National Antarctic Exhibition. So although they didn't go there, they certainly are a kind of part of the story of Argentina's visits to Antarctica. the European countries that have holdings in Antarctica are very wary of Argentina because they have made it clear that they would like to mine coal in Antarctica. So they're a bit of the pariah of the team because they will be the first ones to break the Antarctic Treaty once they get a chance when the renegotiations happen in a few years' time. Here's another one from the same era. This one's from their base, this ship. And once again, you can see that the same orchids are on it. So this is the era when they were producing these kind of covers. It's quite interesting, but I have no other information about them. That's the trouble. So this is 1988. Fits nicely with the stamps. All about concurrent. The Japanese still have a holding in Antarctica. We normally think about them going there to take whales, but in actual fact, they have their own interest in it, an Antarctic expedition. And as you can see, this is the 35th one. The habanera orchid, the one on the right-hand side, is actually a Funsato. It's Japanese stamp. This is from a local post office. So somebody took that with them when they went to Antarctica deliberately to stick it on a cover, because that wasn't available in a wide area of Japan, just in one prefecture. New Zealand still holds a chunk. This is a kind of a sort of a combination cover. They took with them an orchid conference stamp, so you get two orchids there. The base itself, Vanda Station, well, a Vanda is an orchid as well. And so this cover has kind of ticks all the boxes. You got an orchid and you got the orchid name. And this one was sent to somebody in Russia, in Leningrad. So goodness knows what their connection was with Scott Base, but they certainly received a very interesting cover. The map in the middle postmark at the bottom, that's where the two New Zealand bases are. So Vanda and Scott Base, they're quite a distance apart, but they are their holdings in Antarctica. This is what Vanda Station looks like because it's on the 40-cent stamp. And once again, this is a completely legitimate cover, if you like, except for it's sent to somebody who's got a PO box. But there we go. Signed by the postmaster, who seems to be called Slattery. But you get the idea. The landscape is anywhere where it's flat. These buildings are built up on stilts, so they don't disturb the permafrost that's underneath, and obviously it allows for more insulation so that they stay, I don't know what's the right word, stay as warm as possible. This is a 1985 one. You can just about make it out. And so I thought I ought to have some near Antarctic orchids, because otherwise I don't get to show some of the interesting things. So this is the Macquarie Islands, and as you can see from the four Australian Antarctic Territory stamps, you've got some quite interesting landscapes. There are certainly some plants, lots of grasslands and boglands and so on, all the kinds of things that we have assumed it's like in the north of Canada. And so in amongst these things, there are some orchids. There are two of them. They're about 50 millimeters high, which is not very big. There's two of them, Namato Cereus, and you can see their two Latin names there. They are very, very much endangered. Somebody walking across this landscape could potentially make them go extinct. It's that fragile. And so the Australians are very, very conscious of this. They've been going there for quite a while. So this is a cover to London. You can see it's got the Macquarie stamp. Believe it or not, underneath that emu, there is an orchid. And here's another one, but this is from Heard Island, another island just in this same archipelago. And this one shows Thalimitra aristati, a proper Australian orchid. And there is all the details of these two Australian territories out in the middle of the Southern Ocean. They aren't inside the Arctic Circle, but they are technically in the Antarctic kind of habitat, as it were. But you can see them from their stamps. And that, would you believe it, is all I'd done.
Thank you very much, Mark. That's absolutely wonderful.
I don't know.